The wind howled like a starving wolf across the high desert plains of the Arizona Territory, 1876. Snow came down in heavy, slanting sheets, burying the land beneath a cruel white silence. Every blade of grass, every brittle mesquite branch, every forgotten fence post had vanished beneath the blizzard's rage. The prairie, once a stretch of open gold and sage, was now a wasteland of ghostly gray and endless cold. Clara Mae Dawson had been born to the saddle, but even a cowgirl's grit had its limits. Her hands were cracked and bleeding from the cold as she struggled to keep the small fire alive inside the ruins of an old trapper's cabin. The flames flickered weakly, barely licking the blackened stones of the hearth. She fed it the last of her kindling, splintered boards from a broken chair, and prayed it would hold until morning. Outside, her horse, Buckshot, lay still in the snow. She'd tried to save him, to keep him moving, but the storm had been stronger than both of them. When he fell, his eyes wide and glassy, Clara had known she was truly alone. She'd cried then, not for the horse, not really, but for the long, empty miles between her and the nearest ranch house. Her breath had turned to ice as she whispered a prayer for the both of them. Clara wasn't helpless by nature. She'd been working cattle since she was 12, roping steers beside men twice her size. But after the accident, the one that left her leg twisted and stiff, she'd been left behind. The rancher she worked for said she was better off keeping the fire warm than chasing cattle. She'd left that job with her pride still burning, determined to start her own small herd on the land her father once dreamed of owning. But dreams, she was learning, didn't stand a chance against the winter. Her wagon had broken an axle crossing the dry creek bed 2 days before the storm hit. She'd limped the mule and Buckshot as far as she could before the cold sank its claws in. Now she was stranded, her supplies down to half a sack of beans, a tin of coffee grounds, and a strip of jerky as tough as saddle leather. The wind blew through the cracks of the cabin walls like a living thing, moaning and whistling, stealing the warmth right from her bones. She pulled the old wool blanket tighter around her shoulders, feeling the dull ache in her leg pulse with every heartbeat. The injury was years old, but the cold made it throb like it was fresh. She could still remember the day her horse threw her. The snap of bone, the blinding pain, and the doctor's grim face when he told her she'd walk again, but never ride the same. Every limp reminded her of that fall, of the life that had changed in an instant. Now, as the storm raged on, Clara Mae began to understand what real silence was. Not the peace of an open prairie at dusk, but the silence that follows when the world forgets you. She thought of the few folks she'd known back at the settlement. Old Mrs. Harlan, who made biscuits on Sundays. The 2 Dawson boys who always offered to fetch her water. The ranch hands who'd stopped calling her cowgirl and started calling her cripple. None of them knew where she was, and if she didn't make it through the night, none of them ever would. She closed her eyes, trying to imagine the warmth of a fire in her father's old cabin back in Texas. The smell of coffee and cedar smoke. The sound of his voice saying, "You've got a strong heart, girl. Don't you ever give up." But when she opened her eyes again, all she saw was the weak glow of the dying fire. The wind pressed against the walls, shaking them like a warning. She was running out of wood, out of food, out of time. Still, she whispered to herself through chattering teeth, "Not tonight. I ain't dying tonight." And in the storm outside, somewhere far beyond the snow and the dark, something moved, a shape in the distance, unseen but drawing closer. By the time the storm settled into a steady, whispering fall of snow, the fire in Clara Mae Dawson's hearth had dwindled to embers. The little cabin creaked with the cold, its timbers moaning like old bones. The wind had lost some of its bite, but it still slipped through every gap and crack, stinging her face when she turned toward the door. She'd been counting the hours by the dim light that filtered through a frost-covered window. Maybe it was morning. Maybe it was still the same night. The storm had blurred time itself, turning minutes into hours and hours into days. Clara forced herself to move, dragging her bad leg toward the corner where she kept her supplies. Her boot struck something hard, a tin cup frozen to the floor. She gritted her teeth, pried it loose, and scraped the last spoonful of coffee grounds into a small pot. The water she melted from snow was cloudy and tasted like wood smoke, but it was hot, and that was enough. She sipped slowly, feeling the heat seep into her chest. "That's the way, girl," she whispered to herself, her voice hoarse and thin. "Keep the fire inside if nowhere else." Her stomach cramped from hunger. She hadn't eaten since the night before. A handful of beans boiled until they split, and a corner of jerky she chewed until it turned to leather in her mouth. She'd been careful to ration her food, but the storm had lasted longer than she'd ever expected. The sack of beans was nearly empty now and the jerky was gone. Even if she survived another day or two, what then? She looked toward the door. Somewhere out there, beyond the white blur of the snow, Buckshot's body lay frozen solid. She hated the thought, but the hunger gnawed at her reason. She'd dressed game before, eaten wild things when times were lean, but this was different. Buckshot had carried her through years of dust, heat, and rain. He wasn't just a horse. He'd been the last piece of her old life. Still, hunger has no mercy. By mid-afternoon, she bundled herself in the thickest blanket she had and limped outside. The cold hit her like a slap, stealing her breath. The snow came to her knees, soft and treacherous. The wind burned her eyes until tears froze on her lashes. When she reached Buckshot, she knelt beside him, pressing a trembling hand to his neck. "You did good, boy," she murmured, voice breaking. "You got me farther than I had any right to go." She couldn't bring herself to take the knife from her belt. Not yet. Instead, she bowed her head, whispered a prayer, and turned back toward the cabin. That's when she saw it, a thin trail of smoke rising faintly from the ridge to the east. Her heart gave a sudden, painful jolt. Smoke meant fire. Fire meant people, maybe another trapper, a traveler, someone heading for the settlements. She blinked, trying to be sure it wasn't a trick of her eyes, but the gray column still curled into the sky. Hope and fear tangled in her chest. The nearest ranch should have been at least 20 miles south. No settler she knew camped this far up the canyon in winter. If there were people there, they were either lost or didn't want to be found. Clara hesitated. Her leg throbbed with every heartbeat. She could barely make it across the clearing, much less climb a ridge in the snow. But the thought of another night alone gnawed at her worse than the hunger. She went back inside, fed the last scrap of wood into the fire, and stood by the door thinking. If she stayed, she'd starve. If she went, she might freeze. For a long while, she simply stared at the horizon, where the smoke bent and drifted in the wind. Then she spoke aloud, as if her father could still hear her. "Guess we'll take our chances, Pa." But before she could gather her courage, before she could even wrap the blanket around her shoulders, she heard a sound that didn't belong to the storm, faint at first, then clearer. The crunch of snow under heavy boots, the creak of leather, the unmistakable rhythm of someone or something walking toward her cabin. Her breath caught in her throat. She reached for the rifle, leaning against the wall, heart hammering, eyes fixed on the door. Out in the pale white silence, a shadow moved. Someone was coming. Clara Mae Dawson stood frozen beside the hearth, her breath a cloud in the dim air. The sound came again, the deliberate crunch of boots breaking the crusted snow. Not the shuffling of an animal, not the wind dragging a branch across the roof, but the unmistakable rhythm of a human step. Her fingers closed around the rifle's stock. It was an old Winchester, the lever stiff from cold, but it still held 3 cartridges. She'd used it to scare off coyotes and once a drifter, who thought a crippled woman made for easy pickings. Now she held it tight, the barrel aimed at the door. For a long moment all was still. Only the storm's breath moved through the cracks. Then came a knock, soft, deliberate, like someone asking permission rather than demanding entry. Clara's heart hammered against her ribs. "Who's there?" she called out, her voice rough with fear and the cold. No answer. Another knock, slower this time. She swallowed hard, forcing strength into her voice. "I'm armed. Don't come through that door unless you're friendly." Still silence. Then a low voice, calm and deep, spoke through the wood. "You are alone?" The accent was heavy, the English rough around the edges. Clara hesitated, uncertain. Her mind leapt to the smoke she'd seen earlier on the ridge. Whoever this was, they'd seen her fire. Maybe they wanted shelter. Maybe they wanted her food and what little was left. She took a breath and limped closer to the door. "Who are you?" There was a pause, then the voice replied, "Taza. I hunt in these hills. You are cold. Taza." The name rolled unfamiliar in her ears, but the tone, not threatening, just steady, eased some of the tension from her shoulders. Slowly, she slid the bolt aside, keeping the rifle half raised. When she opened the door, a swirl of snow swept in, stinging her face. The man who stood there was tall and broad-shouldered, his dark hair tied back with a strip of leather. His face was strong and weathered, marked by the wind and sun of a lifetime outdoors. He wore a buffalo hide wrapped tight over his shoulders, and in one hand he carried a small bundle of kindling. For a moment, neither spoke. They only stared, two strangers framed by the storm. Taza broke the silence first. "You keep small fire," he said, glancing at the faint glow behind her. "Too small. You freeze tonight." Clara's instinct told her to shut the door. The old fears her father had planted long ago, stories of Apache raids, of travelers vanishing in the desert, echoed in her mind. But she was too weak, too cold, and too alone to chase away help. Her voice came out low. "I'm managing." Taza's dark eyes flicked to her leg, where the stiff brace showed beneath her blanket. Then to her shaking hands. He gave a single nod, as though he understood something without needing to ask. He stepped forward, holding out the bundle of wood. "For fire," he said simply. She hesitated, then reached for it. "You don't have to." "Cold kills both Apache and white," he interrupted, his tone quiet but firm. "No difference." The words hung between them, soft and strange. Clara took the wood and turned back to the hearth. The fire caught again, flaring with new light. Taza stepped inside, brushing snow from his shoulders. He smelled of smoke and pine, of wilderness and distance. She kept the rifle close but didn't raise it. Something in his calm unnerved her. Not danger, but a steadiness she hadn't felt in weeks. "Where'd you come from?" she asked after a moment. "Mountains," he said. "I follow elk. Storm take them south." His gaze drifted toward the window where snow still fell like feathers. "Storm take me too." Clara gave a tired smile. "You and me both." Taza turned back to her, studying her face in the flickering firelight. "You have food?" She shook her head. "Not much left." Without another word, he set down his pack, untied it, and drew out a strip of dried meat and a pouch of cornmeal. He placed them by the fire and said simply, "We share." Clara stared at him, at this stranger who had walked out of the storm, offering warmth and food without asking anything in return. Maybe it was the hunger, or the exhaustion, or the sheer relief of not being alone anymore, but for the first time in days, her eyes filled with tears. She turned away, wiping them on her sleeve. "Guess you're stuck with me, Taza." He gave a small nod, lowering himself near the fire. Better two than one. Outside, the wind began to die. Inside, the lone fire burned brighter than it had since the storm began. The fire crackled low in the cabin, filling the room with the soft scent of pine sap and smoke. For the first time in days, Clara Mae Dawson felt something close to warmth. The Apache man, Taza, sat cross-legged by the hearth, sharpening a small bone-handled knife against a flat stone. His movements were slow, deliberate, the kind of calm that came from living close to the land. Clara sat opposite him, her blanket drawn tight around her shoulders. The color had begun to return to her face, though her hand still trembled when she tried to hold the tin cup he'd filled with broth. The taste was wild and rich, made from some meat she couldn't name, but she drank it gratefully. "You saved this for yourself?" she asked softly. Taza looked up. "Food for travel," he said. But Storm took travel, so now food for life. Clara let out a tired laugh. "You got a way of putting things plain." He smiled faintly, though his eyes stayed serious. "Plain is best. Snow don't listen to talk." Outside, the wind had died down to a whisper. The storm was breaking. But that didn't mean safety, not yet. The cold was still deep enough to kill, and Clara's strength was wearing thin. She shifted, trying to stretch her stiff leg, and gasped as pain shot through her hip. Her breath caught in her throat. Taza was on his feet before she could wave him off. "Your leg?" "Old injury," she managed through clenched teeth. "Ain't nothing new." He knelt beside her, studying the brace and the way she winced when she moved. "You cannot walk far." "I can walk enough." She tried to stand to prove it, but the floor tilted beneath her. Her knee gave out and she fell back into the chair with a sharp cry. Taza caught her before she hit the ground, his hands steady and strong beneath her arms. For a heartbeat, their eyes met. Hers defiant, his calm but unreadable. "Enough to die in snow," he said quietly. She looked away, cheeks burning. "You don't have to help me." "Storm not done," he said, glancing toward the frost-lined window. "And you are alone. You stay, you die. You walk, you die, so—" He gestured toward the world beyond the cabin. "I take you," she blinked, not understanding. "Take me where?" "My camp," he said simply. "Many days from here, food, fire, people. Clara stared at him, disbelief flooding her tired mind. You'd do that? For a stranger? Taza's jaw tightened slightly. For a person. For a long time she didn't speak. She'd grown up hearing men curse the Apache, calling them thieves, killers, savages. But the man in front of her had offered her life when the people of her own town would have written her off as lost. I can't pay you, she said finally. I did not ask, he replied. Still, pride was a stubborn thing. I don't want to be a burden. Taza stood, moving to the door. A burden is only heavy when one carries it alone. He looked back at her, his expression unreadable in the dim light. You rest now. I build something. Before she could question him, he stepped outside into the cold once more. Through the cracks in the cabin wall, Clara watched him work, silent, tireless, shaping branches and hides into a kind of sled. He lashed it together with rawhide, his movements quick and sure. When he finished, he tested it with his own weight, nodding in approval. By the time he came back inside, she had tears in her eyes. Not from pain, but from something deeper. No one had looked at her like she was worth saving in a long time. You really mean to haul me through snow on that thing? She asked, trying to hide the tremor in her voice. Taza gave a single nod. You will ride. I will walk. The storm will rest soon. Then we go. Clara stared into the fire, the flames reflecting in her eyes. You're a fool, she whispered. Maybe, he said. But a living fool. He sat down again, feeding more wood into the flames. Outside, dawn was beginning to touch the horizon, pale and cold but real. The storm had passed. Clara looked at the man beside her, this quiet stranger from the mountains, and realized the truth of what he'd said. Alone, she wouldn't survive another night. Together, maybe they both stood a chance. For the first time since the blizzard began, she felt a spark of something she hadn't dared to feel in weeks. Hope. By dawn, the world had turned to glass. The snow had hardened overnight, the drifts frozen smooth under a pale sky streaked with rose and silver. Clara Mae Dawson woke to the soft rasp of leather and wood, the sound of Taza readying the sled he had built from branches and rawhide. He moved with quiet efficiency, layering furs and blankets inside the frame, checking each knot twice. His breath hung white in the air. He didn't speak much, but when he did, every word carried purpose. Clara sat in the doorway wrapped in her coat, her leg aching in the cold. She watched him work, a mixture of awe and guilt swirling in her chest. You're really fixin' to drag me all that way? She asked finally. Taza didn't look up. You cannot walk. You cannot stay. There is no other way. She tried to laugh, but it came out as a weak cough. You always talk in riddles. He allowed himself the faintest of smiles. No, only truth. When he was finished, he approached her with a fur-lined wrap. Cold comes fast, he said. You must be ready. She hesitated, glancing toward the horizon, an endless sweep of white and shadow. You sure about this, Taza? Your people. They won't take kindly to you showing up with a white woman, not this far from the settlements. He looked at her then, his eyes dark and steady as river stones. My people will ask why. I will tell them Storm gave her to me. I carry what the storm gives. She didn't quite know what that meant, but the way he said it silenced her protest. He lifted her gently, one arm under her knees, the other behind her back. Clara tensed. She hadn't been carried since she was a child, but exhaustion left her no strength to argue. His chest was solid as granite, his warmth steady against the chill wind. Outside, the world was painfully bright. Sunlight reflected off the snow like shards of glass, forcing her to squint. The air bit at her cheeks, but under the heavy fur Taza wrapped around her, she felt safe, safer than she had any right to feel. As he set her carefully in the sled, she touched his sleeve.
Why are you doing this, Taza?
You don't even know me. He paused, tying the rope around his waist. I know hunger, he said simply. I know cold. I know what it is to be left. The word struck something deep in her, a truth she understood too well. Then he leaned forward, took hold of the rope, and began to walk. The sled creaked softly as it slid over the snow. Each step he took left a dark print in the white crust. The wind carried only the sound of his breath and the faint jingle of the knife at his belt. Clara watched the back of his shoulders move beneath the buffalo hide, steady, tireless, like the rhythm of the earth itself. For the first few miles, she tried to talk. She asked about his camp, about the land, about whether he thought there'd be game left after the storm. He answered in short phrases, but she could tell he was listening. "Do you always travel alone?" she asked at last. "Not always," he said. "But sometimes alone is safer." She nodded, thinking of all the nights she'd spent trying to prove she didn't need anyone, and how wrong she'd been. When the wind picked up, Taza stopped long enough to adjust the hide around her shoulders. He gave her water from a leather pouch, shared a small strip of dried meat, and said, "You must eat, even when it hurts." Hours passed. The world narrowed to snow, silence, and the rhythm of his steps. By late afternoon, clouds rolled in again, dimming the sun. Taza found a small stand of pines and stopped. He cleared a patch of snow, built a fire, and melted snow for water. Clara tried to help, but her hands shook too badly. "Rest," he said. "Fire listens better to one voice." She smiled faintly at that, her eyelids heavy. "You sure you're not some kind of preacher?" Taza looked up from the fire, a faint glint of humor in his eyes. "If I was, I would ask for silence." She laughed, and a soft, surprised sound that hung in the cold air. As night fell, the firelight painted gold across the snow, and Clara realized something that startled her. She wasn't afraid anymore. Not of the storm. Not of dying. Not even of the stranger who'd carried her from the edge of death. Taza sat on the far side of the flames, sharpening his knife again, his face unreadable in the light. She watched him until her eyes closed. The last thing she thought before sleep took her was that perhaps, just perhaps, the storm hadn't come to end her life, but to bring this man across her path. The burden he carried was her life, and for now he bore it without complaint. The mountains rose sharp and cold against the gray sky, their peaks wreathed in thin curls of mist. For 3 long days, Taza pulled Clara Mae Dawson through the frozen wilderness, across narrow ridges, through pine-shadowed ravines, and over frozen streams that cracked like thunder beneath the sled. Each night, he built a fire and shared what little food he carried. Each morning he rose before dawn, wordless and steady, his breath coming in clouds as he leaned into the rope again. Clara had stopped protesting. Her pride, like the storm, had softened under the weight of necessity. By the 4th day, her world had shrunk to the sound of his steps, slow, rhythmic, unyielding. She drifted in and out of sleep, the cold pressing against her bones, her dreams filled with shifting light and strange words she didn't understand. Then, one morning, she woke to voices. She blinked against the light. The sled had stopped. Around her stood several figures wrapped in hides and blankets, their dark hair braided, their faces painted in muted streaks of earth tones. They watched her in silence, not cruelly, but with a wary curiosity, as if unsure whether she was real. Taza stood a few feet away, speaking low in his own language. His words were calm but firm, his hands open at his sides. The others answered sharply. A man about Taza's age gesturing toward Clara, his tone edged with disbelief. Clara struggled to sit up, heart pounding. "Taza, and what's happening?" He turned toward her briefly. "My people," he said. "They ask why I bring you." She swallowed hard. "And what do you tell them?" "That the storm gave you to me." He said it so simply, as though that was explanation enough. One of the older women, her long silver hair streaked with black, stepped forward, studying Clara with eyes that saw more than they revealed. She spoke to Taza quietly, then knelt beside Clara. Without a word, she placed a warm hand on Clara's forehead. Her palm was calloused but gentle. She said something that sounded like a blessing, then nodded to Taza. He relaxed slightly. "My mother," he said. "Nalin." Nalin gestured toward the camp, a ring of low huts built from hides and saplings, half hidden in a grove of juniper and pine. Smoke drifted from the center, carrying the scent of cedar and roasted meat. Taza lifted the front of the sled again and began pulling her toward the firelight. Clara tried to speak, to thank him, but her voice came out as a whisper. Her body felt heavier with each passing step. By the time they reached the campfire, she was shaking uncontrollably. Nalin and 2 younger women moved quickly, lifting her from the sled and wrapping her in thick blankets. They brought her a bowl of steaming broth that smelled of herbs and wild onion. She sipped it slowly, the warmth spreading through her chest. Around her, the Apache spoke in low tones. Some looked suspicious, others curious. The younger children peeked from behind their mothers' skirts, wide-eyed at the sight of the pale, half-frozen woman their hunter had dragged in from the wild. Clara tried to offer a faint smile, but her lips trembled too much to form one. Nalin touched her shoulder and said something softly in Apache. When Clara glanced helplessly at Taza, he translated, "She says the fire remembers the lost. You are welcome to sit by it." That broke something in Clara, the weeks of fear, the ache of being unwanted. Tears welled in her eyes before she could stop them. She looked down, embarrassed. "Please tell her." "Thank you," Taza translated, and Nalin nodded, pressing a hand briefly to Clara's cheek. Over the next few days, Clara began to regain her strength. Nalin treated her leg with poultices that smelled of sage and pine, and though the pain didn't vanish, the swelling eased. Taza hunted during the daylight hours, returning each evening with rabbits, quail, or sometimes nothing at all. When he came back, he would sit near the fire and listen quietly as Clara spoke. Her stories of ranch life, of horses and storms, of her father who taught her how to rope cattle and play cards better than most men. He rarely interrupted, but sometimes she caught the faint curve of a smile when she made him laugh. The others still watched her with guarded eyes, but slowly, the tension began to fade. The children brought her bits of carved wood and pine cones as gifts. Nalin sat beside her, teaching her a few Apache words: water, fire, friend. And one night, as the fire crackled low and Taza handed her a bowl of stew, Clara realized something had shifted. She was no longer a stranger in their camp, she was something else. Not yet one of them, but no longer alone in the wilderness either. The storm had carried her to a place she could never have imagined. And though she didn't know it yet, it had also carried her toward something far greater than survival. Winter settled deep into the mountains. The snow no longer came in fierce blizzards, but in quiet, drifting flurries that dusted the trees like sugar. Smoke curled from the Apache camp in thin gray ribbons, rising toward a pale, empty sky. Clara Mae Dawson had been there nearly 3 weeks. Her leg had healed enough for her to hobble short distances with a stick Taza carved for her. Smooth, sturdy, and just the right height. She spent most of her days near the fire pit, helping Nalin and the other women mend hides or dry strips of venison. Her fingers, once stiff from the cold, had regained their strength. It surprised her how easily she'd fallen into their rhythm. Life in the camp wasn't loud or hurried. It moved in steady cycles. The crackle of fires, the scrape of knives, the songs that rose softly at night when the wind grew still. And Taza. He came and went like the shadow of the hills, quiet and reliable. Each morning before dawn he would leave with his bow slung across his back and return at dusk, his shoulders dusted with snow. Sometimes he brought back game, sometimes only pine branches for the fire, but he never complained. He spoke little, though not from coldness. Clara learned to hear the meaning in his silences, the way he looked toward the horizon before a storm, or the way his brow softened when he saw her walk a little farther than the day before. One evening, after the sun dipped behind the ridges, Clara sat near the fire, mending a tear in her coat. Taza approached quietly, carrying something in his hands. "I bring this," he said, kneeling beside her. It was a small pouch made of tanned deer hide, tied with a strip of sinew. When she opened it, she found a handful of smooth stones painted with symbols. Spirals, arrows, and stars. "What are they?" she asked, her voice hushed. "Story stones," he said. "My mother makes them for children to learn the old ways. But I think you should have them." "You have stories too," Clara smiled faintly. "Mine aren't worth painting." He shook his head. "Stories keep people alive. Yours brought you here." She didn't know how to answer that. Instead, she turned one of the stones over in her palm, a spiral painted in red ochre. "What's this one mean?" "Journey without end," he said. Her gaze lifted to his, and for a long moment neither looked away. The firelight flickered between them, warm against the cold air. Something in his eyes, calm, steady, unguarded, made her chest tighten in a way she hadn't felt in years. She cleared her throat and looked down again. "I don't know about journeys without end. I just want to make it back alive." He gave a small nod. Alive is a good beginning. That night she couldn't sleep. The fire burned low and the camp had fallen into stillness. She lay awake under her blanket, listening to the wind sigh through the pines. Across the fire, Taza sat sharpening an arrowhead, the light glinting off the blade. "Why'd you really help me?" she asked quietly. He didn't look up. "Because no one helped my sister." The words hung heavy between them. Clara pushed herself up on one elbow. What happened? He paused, then said simply, The soldiers came. Long time ago. She was hurt. We could not carry her fast enough. His voice was steady, but beneath it was a weight she could feel. Not anger, not even grief, but something older and deeper. I'm sorry, Clara whispered. He gave a small nod, still looking at the arrowhead. You do not have to be sorry. You are not the one who left her. She stared into the fire. The crackle and pop of the flames seemed louder in the silence that followed. After a while, she said softly, Then maybe this is your chance to make it right. Taza looked up, and for the first time she saw something like warmth flicker behind his calm exterior. Maybe, he said. Days turned into weeks. They shared the work, the meals, the quiet company of survival. He taught her to read tracks in the snow and to listen to the sound of trees bending under ice. She showed him how to mend torn fabric and sharpen a knife with a steady hand. When she laughed, a real laugh, light and unguarded, he'd glance her way and almost smile, though he never quite did. And yet, under the hush of winter, something fragile and undeniable began to grow, a bond forged not in words or promises, but in the quiet moments between them. Neither of them named it, neither dared to, but both felt it all the same. The days began to lengthen, though winter still held the mountains in its frozen grip. The air softened slightly, and the snow on the lower ridges began to weep into narrow rivulets that trickled down toward the dry plains. For the first time since the storm, Clara Mae Dawson felt something close to peace. She had found a rhythm among the Apache, a place in their quiet world. She helped Nayland tend to the fire pits, learned to grind dried corn into meal, and even managed to take a few careful steps beyond the camp without her stick. Each step still sent a twinge through her leg, but she bore it proudly. Taza watched from a distance, his expression unreadable but faintly approving. When he caught her eye, she'd grin and say, Told you I'm tougher than I look. He'd nod, answering in that steady way of his. You walk like a coyote, slow, but you do not fall. Life had settled into a calm rhythm, but peace in that land was a fragile thing. It never lasted long. It was near dusk when they first saw the riders. A boy from the camp came running up the slope, breathless, his dark hair flying. He spoke rapidly in Apache, his words sharp with urgency. Taza's face hardened. He turned toward the valley below, his hand shading his eyes. From where Clara stood, she could just make out a thin line of movement along the snow-covered plain. Men on horseback, their shapes small against the white earth. The fading light caught on something metallic. Rifles. Her heart dropped. Taza motioned for her to follow as the camp stirred into quiet, efficient motion. The women began packing hides and supplies. Children ushered into the shelter of the trees. The men gathered weapons, lit bows, lances, a few old rifles. Who are they? She asked, though she already suspected. Bluecoats, Taza said. Cavalry. They come north after tracks, and maybe ours. Clara's pulse quickened. She turned toward the valley again, squinting. If they see the camp, they will see smoke, he said grimly. And they will come. Fear pressed cold against her ribs. She knew how the soldiers saw the Apache. Wild, dangerous, less than human. And if they found her here, a white woman among them, they would not ask questions. They would assume the worst. Taza began speaking quickly to the others, his tone commanding but calm. Nayland came to Clara's side, pressing a bundle of hides into her arms. You stay, she said in halting English. No fire, quiet. Clara looked at Taza. What are you going to do? Hide the camp, he said. And watch. She wanted to argue, but the look in his eyes stopped her. It wasn't fear, it was resolve. The kind that came from years of surviving under threat. As the last light drained from the sky, the camp fell into silence. The smoke from the fires was smothered under snow. The children were hidden in dugouts among the rocks. The forest became still, a heartbeat holding its breath. From her hiding place, Clara could hear the distant jingle of spurs and the snort of horses. The sound grew louder, echoing off the canyon walls. She crouched low, heart hammering, then up voices. Harsh barking commands. The soldiers had arrived. Through the branches, she caught glimpses of blue coats and gloved hands, the dull gleam of rifles slung across saddles. There were maybe 10 of them. Their leader dismounted, scanning the trees. One of the men pointed toward a scrap of fabric fluttering near a tree. One of Clara's old bandages, left to dry. Her stomach clenched. The officer turned his horse toward the slope, shouting orders. The soldiers began to spread out, their boots crunching in the snow. Taza appeared beside her suddenly, silent as shadow. He crouched low, his bow in hand. "They look for you," he whispered. Clara's throat tightened. "Me?" he nodded. "They will think you are taken. If they find you here, they will kill us all." Her breath came fast and shallow. "Then I have to go to them." Taza's head snapped toward her. "No, it's the only way," she said, her voice shaking. "If I walk out there alone, tell them I survived the storm, that I found shelter, they'll leave. But if they see me here with you—" He stared at her, his jaw tightening. "They will take you, maybe," she said. "But they won't kill your people." For a long, terrible moment, they held each other's gaze. The cold air stung her face, but her resolve didn't waver. Finally, Taza's shoulders dropped. "You would lie for us?" "I'd do more than that," she said softly. "You saved my life," the wind whispered through the trees. Then, without a word, he reached out and pressed his hand against her heart. Just once, a gesture of both warning and gratitude. "Go," he said quietly, "before they find the trail." Clara took a deep breath and stepped out of hiding into the pale light of the soldiers' lanterns. The snow gave a soft crunch under Clara Mae Dawson's boots as she limped out from the tree line, one hand raised to shield her eyes from the soldiers' lanterns. Her breath clouded in the cold air, her heart pounding so hard she could hear it over the jingle of spurs and the creak of leather. The cavalrymen turned as one, rifles half raised, horses snorting and pawing at the icy ground. For a moment no one spoke. They just stared, disbelief frozen on their faces. Then a voice broke the stillness. "Holy hell. Is that a woman?" The B. officer, a tall man with a frost-rimed mustache and a hard, sunburned face, swung down from his saddle and approached, his gloved hand resting on the butt of his revolver. "Ma'am," he said slowly, "state your name." "Clara Mae Dawson," she said, her voice trembling but clear. "From the Dawson Ranch, south of Fort Lowell." The officer's eyes narrowed. "You were reported missing. Wagon wreck out by the river, wasn't it?" She nodded. "Storm caught me. Lost my horse, my mule, everything. Been walking near 2 weeks." The men exchanged uneasy glances. One muttered something about miracles. Another crossed himself. The officer's tone softened just a fraction. "You're lucky to be alive. We've been tracking signs up this way. Thought maybe a raiding party took you." His gaze drifted past her toward the dark tree line where Taza and the others were hidden. "You seen any Indians in these parts?" Clara hesitated. Just for an instant. But she knew that a pause too long could be death for them all. "No," she said, shaking her head. "Not a soul. Just snow and God's own silence." The officer studied her face for a long moment. "You sure about that?" "I'd stake my life on it." Behind her words, her heart beat like thunder. He seemed to accept it. "We're chasing a small band," he said. "Apache, maybe a dozen. Took some horses from the garrison at San Pedro. If they come this way, you'd best steer clear." "I'll do that," she said quietly. He turned to his men. "Sergeant, get her a blanket and some water." One of the soldiers dismounted and offered her a canteen. Clara took it, though her hands trembled so badly she nearly dropped it. Every instinct screamed at her to glance back, to see if Taza was still there, but she didn't dare. One wrong look could undo everything. The officer stepped closer again. "You're hurt," he said, eyeing her limp. "There's an aid station 15 miles west. We can take you there." Panic surged in her chest. If she went with them, they'd discover the truth soon enough. Her tracks would lead back toward the hidden camp. And Taza would come after her. He wouldn't let her vanish without a word. "I'll be all right," she said quickly. "My old place isn't far. I can make it." He frowned. "Ma'am, that's not—" "I said I can make it." Her voice cracked with more strength than she felt. The officer looked at her for a long moment, then finally sighed. "Suit yourself. But you shouldn't be out here alone." "I won't be," she said softly. Not for long. He nodded once, then mounted his horse. Men, let's move out. We'll sweep south. The column turned, their boots and hooves crunching through the snow. The officer tipped his hat to her as they passed. Good luck to you, Miss Dawson. She waited until they were nothing but blue shadows fading into the dusk before she let out the breath she'd been holding. Her knees buckled and she sank to the ground, shaking. From the woods behind her came the faintest whisper of movement, the soft tread of moccasins on snow. Taza appeared at her side, silent as a ghost. His eyes searched hers, reading everything she couldn't say. They are gone, he said. She nodded weakly. They believed me. He studied her face, the color gone from her cheeks, her lips trembling from the cold and fear. Then with a quiet gravity, he said, You saved them. Clara looked away, tears blurring her vision. They'd have killed you all, she whispered. I couldn't let that happen. Taza crouched beside her, resting a hand gently on her shoulder. Now they think you are alone, he said. You must go before they return. She met his eyes, dark, steady, full of something unspoken. And you? I stay. My people move north. You go home. The words hit harder than the cold wind. Home. After all this, she wasn't sure she knew what that meant anymore. She tried to speak, but her throat closed around the words. All she managed was a quiet, broken, thank you. Taza's hand lingered for a moment on her arm. You are strong, he said. Stronger than the storm. And then, without another word, he turned and vanished into the trees. Clara stood in the silence, staring after him as the last of the bluecoats disappeared beyond the ridge. Her heart ached with the weight of what she'd done, and what she'd lost. She had saved them. But in doing so, she'd set herself adrift once more. Spring came late that year. The snow melted in slow sighs, revealing patches of grass and earth beneath the pines. Rivers once locked in ice began to whisper again, winding through the canyons like veins of silver. At the Dawson Ranch, the fences were broken, the barn half collapsed, and the fields lay wild with weeds. But there was life again, faint, stubborn life. Clara Mae Dawson had returned. The townsfolk near Fort Lowell called it a miracle. They said she'd survived on grit and prayer. When she told them little of what had happened in the mountains, they didn't press. Folks liked miracles more than truths that made them uncomfortable. She fixed what she could, mended the roof, traded a silver brooch for seed grain, hired a boy from town to help mend the fence. Each morning she rose before the sun and worked until her leg ached. But no matter how hard she worked, the silence of the hills stayed with her. Some nights when the wind blew from the north, she'd hear it again, that deep, mournful hum of the winter storms. It carried memory, the smell of pine smoke, the rhythm of a quiet voice speaking words she couldn't always understand but somehow felt. Taza. She tried to forget him, but forgetting was like trying to stop the wind. It just found another way through the cracks. One afternoon, as she was leading a mule from the barn, she saw movement at the edge of the field. Her heart leapt. The shape of a man, still and waiting. For a moment she thought she was dreaming. Then the wind shifted and she saw the eagle feather tied in his hair. She froze, her hand still on the mule's halter. Taza, she whispered. He stepped forward slowly, his moccasins stirring the dust. The sun was behind him, turning his figure into a dark outline against the gold hills. He looked thinner, older somehow, but the calm in his eyes was the same. You found your way back, he said quietly. I did, she breathed. You too. He nodded once. My people move north when the snow goes. I come south to find the place of the storm. She swallowed, her voice thick with emotion. I wasn't sure I'd ever see you again. He glanced toward the broken fences, the fields she was trying to reclaim. You build alone? She gave a faint smile. Mostly. Folks in town don't know what to make of me now. Because you lived with us, he said simply. Because I came back changed, she corrected. They think I lost something out there. But the truth is," she hesitated, her voice barely above a whisper, "I found something instead." The wind tugged at her hair, lifting strands across her face. He stepped closer, close enough that she could see the faint scar along his jaw, the one she'd noticed that night by the fire. "You saved my people," he said. "And you saved me," she replied. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. The air between them was filled with everything they couldn't say. The winter nights, the unspoken bond, the cost of two worlds that could never quite meet. Finally, Taza reached into his satchel and pulled out a small object. He held it out to her. It was one of the story stones, the red spiral she had once held in her palm. "Journey without end," he said softly. Her fingers trembled as she took it. "I thought you'd kept them." "I kept one," he said. "The one for fire. It remembers you." The ache in her chest deepened. "Where will you go?" "North," he said. "Where the rivers begin." She nodded slowly, trying to hold his gaze, trying not to let the tears rise. "And if you ever come back this way," he looked toward the horizon where the sky met the wild hills, "then the wind will tell you first." He turned then, stepping back toward the open land. She wanted to call out, to stop him, to tell him that the ranch, the fences, all of it, meant nothing compared to what they had shared. But the words caught in her throat. She watched as he walked away, his figure growing smaller until it blended with the shimmering heat above the plains. When he was gone, she stood for a long time in the silence, the story stone warm in her palm. The wind swept across the grass, carrying with it the faint scent of pine and smoke, the memory of another world, another life. Clara closed her eyes and whispered into the wind, "Journey without end." And somewhere, far beyond the ridges, the wind answered back,